It's great to be back with you. See a lot of familiar faces and some new faces as well, presumably. Always like in our pandemic adjusted era, it's always like the greatest excitement of the day to see all these faces populate the Zoom room. As you know, or as you might not know, tomorrow we won't read a regular parsha in the regular order of the parshiyot. We have only one left, and that's what we read on Sukkot Torah, B'Zara Bracha. This Shabbat is also the first day of Sukkot, so we have the special Torah reading for Sukkot. So I thought this is a great opportunity as we go into the not only a holiday, but the holiday described by the Mishnah as the holiday par excellence. The Mishnah often doesn't even say Sukkot, it just says Hechag, the festival. And we all know that it's referring to Sukkot. So what is it about Sukkot that makes it the festival par excellence, the festival that had the biggest draw to the temple, the most fabulous, spectacular, and choreographed celebration? What is it about this day? So the first question I want to ask before we jump into any sources, I'm curious, you can raise your hand, either physically or preferably virtually, and share what are some of your associations with Sukkot and its joy? The other thing that the Mishnah and our liturgy refer to Shabbat is Zman Simchatenu, the time of our joy. Shavuot is the time of the giving of the Torah. Pesach is the time of our freedom, and Sukkot is about joy. So something linked not to an historical moment like freedom and revelation, but an emotion. What is the source of that emotion for you for Sukkot? And colloquially, we often refer to Sukkot as kind of, the end of like the holiday season. What does Sukkot feel like a culmination of or a beginning of for you? So feel free to, I'll take a look at the chat and feel free to raise your hand. Happy Destiny, go ahead. You can unmute and share.
I like that this holiday puts us outdoors as the weather is getting colder. And without the holiday, I might just be like, oh, I'm just going to go inside. So it keeps me in nature and community outside.
Great. Thanks, Happy. Phyllis Steiner, go ahead.
I'm thinking that it's a time of hospitality. You have a sukkah and you need to invite people. And so it's a time of celebration.
Fantastic. Thank you, Phyllis. Anybody else?
Rabbi Aryeh, I see Esther's physical hand. So
yeah, Esther, go ahead.
First of all, to me, Sukkot is the only holiday that the word joy appears 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
Once on Pesach and once on Shavuot and 3 times now. But also to me, it balances after the holidays of the high holidays, which are so solemn, it kind of breaks it and into a time of joy. And as a child, it was my favorite holiday because right after Rosh Hashanah, we used to sit around the dining room table and prepare all the decoration for the Sukkah. So it was a lovely time of the year.
Right. The gate still is not closed yet, though our Yom Kippur liturgy seems to think that it does, but then later Hasidic liturgy plays with that. Fantastic. So let's actually look at some sources together. I'm going to, one second. I will share a link to it. I'll share the text, but in case you want to, in case you want to look at the text in a different screen and blow it up or manipulate it however you would like to, I'll give you that option. Just give me one second. Okay, there's the link to the document, the shareable, and I will now share my screen. All right, so to start with, Though on the academic calendar, we're regulated to often think of this as a time of beginning, the beginning of the academic year. From an agricultural time, this is a conclusion. And Sukkot, throughout the liturgy and the literature, appears as a culmination. In the Torah, Sukkot is primarily described as a culmination of the cycle of the three festivals. Not only are there three individual festivals that come in different times, but that they're related to as a cycle, always in the order of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. So you see here in Devarim chapter 16, 3 times in the year, shall every male appear before Adonai your God in the place that God has chosen, on the pilgrimage of Matzot, Chag HaMatzot, on the pilgrimage of Shavuot, and on the pilgrimage of Sukkot. And one should not appear before Adonai empty-handed. V'chag HaMatzot, v'chag HaShavuot, v'chag HaSukkot. Always in that order. Also in Parshat Emor, and Vayikra, in Pinchas, Bamidbar, the other places where the Chagim are mentioned. It always appears as this kind of the closure of the experience of a cycle of 3 pilgrimage festivals. However, in the Jewish experience, the lived experience of time, Sukkot appears as a culmination of a different cycle, of kind of like, certainly anybody who works in non-Jewish contexts or who goes to school in non-parochial Jewish schools and has to explain at like the beginning of September, okay, I'm going to miss these days over the next month. There's a cycle of the Tishrei Chagim. Now, the no text in the Torah really organizes them that way, it just appears. But it sort of like invites interpretation when the Torah says, on the first day of the 7th month is the day of Teruah, and then on the 10th day is the day of atonement, Yom Kippurim, and on the 15th day is the day of harvest, and you should build Sukkot, dwell in Sukkot for 7 days, etc. If it comes so closely after, it really invites a speculation that Yom Teruah, Rosh Hashanah, is connected to Yom Kippurim, and they're both connected to Sukkot just because they're so proximate. And indeed, later halakha and custom encode that relationship to Sukkot as a culmination of the cycle of the Chagim. So you see here, I've brought the very last halakha in the Shulchan Aruch, 16th century central code of halakha, the very last halakha in the laws of Yom Kippur, and the very first halakha in the laws of Sukkot. So the laws of Yom Kippur end as follows. So Orach Chaim, section 624.5. This is the glosses of Rav Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, bringing in Ashkenazi additions to the codification of Rav Yosef Karo. Meticulous people, medaktakim, begin immediately at the end of Yom Kippur with making their sukkah in order to go from mitzvah to mitzvah. Now, we should read this cautiously. He doesn't say that there's an intrinsic connection, thematic connection between Yom Kippur and Sukkot. Could be any mitzvah. Just always good to go from mitzvah to mitzvah, to be, alive with mitzvah. However, there are lots of mitzvot in the Torah. Could have easily said, immediately at the end of Yom Kippur, go give tzedakah. Immediately at the end of Yom Kippur, teach your children Torah. Immediately at the end of Yom Kippur, daven Mariv and say the Shema. There's like a lot of mitzvot that could be enunciated there. So it seems something, though it's not stated explicitly, there seems to be a kind of thematic connection of the kind of mitzvah to be stringing together. There's something, and it's especially striking because building the sukkah isn't itself a mitzvah. The mitzvah is to dwell in the sukkah. If somebody else does it for you, if one person builds it but never eats or sleeps or does anything in it, and the other person doesn't lift a finger in its construction, but lives in it, then the person who lives in it but did nothing to construct it has done the mitzvah. The person who built it but has not dwelled in it has not done the mitzvah. So the Ramah is using the word mitzvah in a kind of not in its narrowest technical precise form. He's using it, and here he's quoting his predecessors. He's using it, I think, in a sense of stringing together the thematics. What are we feeling at the end of Yom Kippur, at kind of like our Jewish best selves, elevated through the intensity, the cleanse of that day? And how do we make sure that we don't crash and come down? Immediately go from that to start preparing to operationalize that feeling of being fully in, fully committed to the mitzvah. So even though it's technically going from mitzvah to logistics for a mitzvah, there's a kind of thematic connection. So Sukkot has this function as a culmination in two different ways. And you look at the very beginning of the Shulchan Aruch in the very next chapter, the laws of Sukkot. In Sukkot, you shall dwell for 7 days, for I made the children of Israel dwell in Sukkot. These are the clouds of glory with which God surrounded them, so that they not be struck by heat or sun. And it's a commandment to set up the Sukkah immediately after Yom Kippur, for when a mitzvah comes upon you, don't let it rot. Mitzvah haba'al yado al yachmitzena. Don't push it off till later. Do it immediately as soon as you can. Now, of course, you're allowed to start building the mitzvah before Yom Kippur also. In a year like this year, when Yom Kippur happens on a Sunday night, a lot of people probably spent Erev Yom Kippur starting to build their sukkah. Because if they had Sunday off and they weren't going to have Tuesday or Wednesday, a lot of people do that. I went to undergrad at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which built a massive sukkah in the courtyard, constructed by custodial staff who aren't even necessarily Jewish, and done weeks in advance. So there, even though none of this is required, there's a codification of an experience of thematic connection. Sukkot is the culmination of the cycle of the festivals. It's a culmination of the high holiday period. So what is Sukkot all about? What are we actually commemorating? The Shulchan Aruch hinted at that, saying these are the clouds of glory. We'll try to understand what that's about momentarily. So what are we actually commemorating? This is the Torah reading, part of the Torah reading that we'll read. In Sukkot, you shall dwell for 7 days. Sukkot teshru shivat yamim. That's the mitzvah. And of course, the rabbis are going to want to unpack what constitutes dwelling, how much of your life to move to the sukkah. But that won't be our focus today. Every citizen in Israel shall dwell in Sukkot, in order that future generations will know that I made the children of Israel live in Sukkot. When I brought them out of the land of Egypt, I am Adonai, your God. L'ma'an yedu doratechem ki v'Sukkot hoshavti et bnei Yisrael v'hotzi'u otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, ani Adonai Elohechem. I want to open it up here for reflection. What is a glaring question or problem in verse 43? We are required to dwell in Sukkot in order that everybody, all the generations, knows that God made the children of Israel live in Sukkot when they were brought out of Egypt. What is the obvious problem? When I say problem, I don't mean that the Torah is deficient. I mean it in the sense of like a math problem, that like there's something that is not on the surface understandable that we've got to do some digging to figure out. What is the problem? Yeah, Laura asks, go ahead.
Yeah, I put it in the chat. It's an ongoing question for me every year. Hopefully this is why Sukkot? We dwelled in tents, not in Sukkot.
Yeah.
There was no. The only thing that might resemble a sukkah was the Mishkan.
You want all the generations to remember that they dwelled in Sukkot. It's the same language we have about Pesach. Like, you know, your children are going to ask, like, what is this? The matzah won't make sense to them. You have to explain it or whatever. But there, it's like there was a thing that they knew, and we're worried about future generations forgetting about it. So here, it's like I want all the generations to know that I had them dwell in Sukkot when coming out of the land of Egypt. And we read the book of Shemot, and there's no mention that God had them dwell in huts in Sukkot on the way out. Why is this only coming up? So some commentators might have the inclination to be like, okay, so yeah, it could have said it earlier, it didn't, but now we find out. And that's something we read back into the narrative when we like dramatize the Exodus narrative. We'll have to dramatize that they lived in Sukkot on the way. It is a little weird, though, if it was not significant enough to merit mention in the narrative. Why is it so important that the future generations continue to know? And in fact, Happy and like you mentioned, like they lived in tents. We don't even see descriptions of tents in that early desert period. We just see where they stopped and like when there wasn't water. It's not like in chapter 16, 17, 18, 19 of Shemot, we see descriptions of tents either. Later, they build a Mishkan, there's an official tent of meeting, a public meeting place. But, Bil'am in the book of Bamidbar looks out at the Israelites, Matovu ohalecha Yaakov. He praises the way their tents look, but it's not even nothing about the physical structure of where they encamped on the way out of Egypt is mentioned in the narrative. If it's so insignificant, why is it so important that we remember? Noreen, go ahead.
I think I look at it metaphorically as living under God's protection in a very precarious situation throughout the whole wilderness. And if you kind of look at it metaphorically, then you can see why it's important for future generations to know that they were under God's protection.
Yeah, so given that the narrative doesn't say anything literal, a lot of the sages, and we'll see this in the Talmud momentarily, are kind of forced in that direction because you're trying to match up a future memory with the narrative of an event that happened. Betsy, you asked, does it harken back to the Garden of Eden? I mean, maybe, but the Torah doesn't say that. It says it harkens back to something else. It says very specifically, it harkens back to the Sukkot that God had the Israelites dwell in on the way out of Egypt. Sukkot, which we've never heard about. So if it also harkens to the Garden of Eden, then we have a second additional problem of why that's not mentioned. So let's jump back into the text. We've identified the problem, the mystery, and I always tell students, when we identify like a good problem, don't ruin a great problem with a mediocre solution. Like often I remember when I taught like 15-year-olds, I would try to get them to slow down and notice that there was a peculiarity, whether in the biblical text or the Mishnah or whatever text we were studying. And immediately the kids, there's a sort of pious instinct always to want to like solve it. No, it's not a problem because it could mean this, it could mean that. And we might engage those solutions, but it's really important to dwell in the problem first. We can't understand, because the Gemara thought it was a problem, and we're not going to be able to understand the significance of what's motivating the Gemara if we don't actually sit with the problem. This is a real problem, and the sages thought it was a problem. When you hear a text say, in order that the future generations will know that I made the children of Israel, you expect to find out something that we read about. And now the additional information here is that this is a really important data piece, not to be lost. Very bizarre for such an important thing not to have been mentioned. Now, what we do see in Shemot chapter 13, so this is the very first chapter after they leave, just to remind you of the chronology. Chapter 12 is the slaying of the firstborn, grabbing the matzah, and leaving. Chapter 13, which is the beginning of Parshat Bashalach, is kind of telling us what route they started to go. Chapter 15 is the crossing of the sea. Chapter 20 is the revelation at Sinai. So here in chapter 13, the beginning of Parshat B'Shalach, it happened when Pharaoh sent the people. God did not leave them by the way of the Philistines, though it was closer. For God said, lest the people change their mind when they see war and turn back toward Egypt. So God sent the people around through the desert toward the Sea of Reeds. The Israelites went up armed from the land of Egypt. And Moshe took Yosef's bones with him, for he had strongly sworn the Israelites, saying, may God really visit you and bring up my bones with you from this. And they traveled from Sukkot and encamped in Etam at the edge of the desert. And Adonai walked before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them on the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to light up the way for them, night and day. The cloud did not dissipate by day, nor the pillar of fire by night before the people. So the Torah never describes them dwelling in actual physical huts, but the first place that they went upon leaving Egypt was a place called Sukkot. And though the Midrashim and the Talmud don't remark about that, which I find interesting itself, peculiar, you don't have to stretch the imagination too much to think that the reason this place was called Sukkot is because it's a place where people who encamped there built Sukkot. Maybe there were like a lot of greenery and like a lot of trees that could be harvested to build temporary huts. But it doesn't say that. It just lists it as a place, Sukkot, and then they went to Etam. And then the very next thing is we find out that God walked before them with this pillar of cloud, and the cloud didn't dissipate by day. So there is this notion of divine protection. Maybe that harkens to the metaphorical read that a few of you offered just moments ago. So we do have these, both the metaphorical and a hint of a physical, literal recollection right there, coming out of Egypt, such that we get a midrash that's in the early work, the Sifra, and then also I brought the version of it in the Talmud Bavli. So it is taught that I made the children of Israel live in Sukkot. That's our verse, which is so peculiar. There's a question that is the ground on which the following two sages walk. They don't mention the question. We have processed the question. Like, what does this mean? So these are the clouds of glory. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva says God made actual Sukkot for them. According to the view attributed here to Rabbi Akiva, the opinions are actually switched in the Sifra, be that as it may. According to the position attributed to Rabbi Akiva here, God made actual Sukkot. Yeah, so it didn't stop and narrate that construction, but God mentioned that there's a place called Sukkot. We could use our imagination, and that actually happened. And so now, this time of year, we have to build Sukkot to commemorate that. And Rabbi Eliezer presumably is thinking, it's too important a detail not to. It was just a place name with no significance. Why would it be that important? It must mean that the physical Sukkot we build are actually commemorating the metaphorically the other way in which God protected the people through the clouds of glory. We can't build clouds, so we build a Sukkah. Now, let me ask you a question. If either way, these clouds of glory or actual Sukkot that weren't mentioned were what Bnei Israel built immediately upon leaving Mitzrayim. And so therefore, now on the 15th day of the 7th month, we have to celebrate this holiday and live in Sukkot. What's the huge problem? How does it follow that God protecting the Israelites with Sukkot on the 16th, 17th, 18th of the month of Nisan requires us to build and live in Sukkot on the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st days of Tishrei. Why are we living in Sukkot now? How does this help us remember something that on the calendar 6 months ago? Has anybody ever like reflected on that before? Anybody reading these verses ever thought like, what if we're doing something about the Exodus, why don't we do this on Pesach? Like, why? Esther, go ahead. Esther, you're still muted.
I like Rabbi Sachs' explanation. Well, he talks about, he connects the word schach to the Mishkan. And he said the Mishkan is the dwelling that is not temporary. We always have it. It doesn't matter where we are. Well, the Mikdash was only temporary. It wasn't there. So I like that connection of schach, which comes from the same root as the Mishkan, as something that God dwells and God is with us, and we can go to synagogue today, and it is okay, even though we don't have the temple.
Wait, pause again, Esther. How is schach from the same root as Mishkan? Mishkan is the root shachan. Sukkah is the root sachach.
I'm just quoting Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Sachs connected the schach to the Mishkan.
Yeah, I mean, okay, we should, Tzarich Iyun, as the rabbis say, it's definitely not the same root. The root for Mishkan is Shin, Kaf, Nun. The root for Sukkah is Samech, Kaf, Kaf.
We also talked about the Kruvim, who face one each other rather than face towards us, as God protection of us.
Okay, and yet the Torah doesn't say dwell in Sukkot for 7 days because I built a Mishkan for God's home. The Torah doesn't make that connection. And also, the Mishkan, humans didn't live in the Mishkan. Only God. The purpose of the Mishkan was v'shachanti b'tocham. I can dwell among them. So there might be other kind of associations, but it's definitely not the direct one that is being described. They also didn't build the Mishkan for a while, whereas what the Torah says is that behotzi otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, in my bringing them out, I had them dwell in Sukkot. Something specifically timed to the month of Nisan. What we do tonight is something to commemorate so that we never forget what happened in the month of Nisan. That's strange.
But
What's that?
Ein mukdam ve'meuchar.
But that means that what ein mukdam ve'meuchar b'Torah doesn't mean things have no calendrical importance. You don't fulfill the mitzvah of matzot if you eat matzah tonight.
Yeah, okay.
Because there's no what ein mukdam ve'meuchar b'Torah is the position of some midrashim and in some commentaries like Rashi that the Torah isn't always narrated chronologically. So, for example, there are thematic reasons to think that the commandments of the Mishkan, to build the Mishkan, are actually given after the sin of the golden calf. That's a big dispute in commentary, but there are thematic literary indications that might be a better way to read it, even though it's told out of order. That's what Ein Mukdam Me'uchar B'Torah means. It certainly doesn't mean we don't care about the calendar. In fact, the calendar is one of the things where dispute is least tolerated. There's the famous story in the Talmud that's the exception to kind of machloket l'shem shamayim, dispute for the sake of heaven, where Rabbi Gamliel the Nasi forces Rabbi Eliezer to violate Yom Kippur publicly, according to Rabbi Eliezer's accounting of when it should be, in order to show that we're all on one calendar. So we definitely care about calendrical precision. And just to make this really clear, what's at stake? We are tonight commemorating something that happened on the 16th of Nisan. If you build a Sukkah on Pesach to live in it, when it actually happened, you have not fulfilled the mitzvah. It's fine to do that. There's no problem to sleep in a hut if you want to on Pesach, but you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of Sukkah. So I want to go back to some texts and share with you a fascinating, famous, and somewhat controversial text of the Vilna Gaon. Vilna Gaon is, of course, the most significant, like the father of all, like the great Lithuanian school of textualism, 18th century. So in his commentary to Shir HaShirim, why it's located there is beyond our time and scope for today. So in discussing something else, in the fourth verse of Shir HaShirim, he says, in this way we have a resolution to the difficulty that has been raised. Why do we do Sukkot and Tishrei? We're not the first ones to ask that question. This is a famous question that has flummoxed Chachamim since the earliest days. Why do we do Sukkot and Tishrei? It doesn't make any sense. We should do Sukkot and Nisan. Since it corresponds to the surrounding protection of the clouds of glory, it would make more sense to do it in Nisan, because the beginning of the surrounding protection of the clouds was in Nisan. Behotzi otam be'eretz Mitzrayim, as the verse says explicitly, when I brought them out from Egypt. However, it seems that since when they made the calf, the golden calf, the clouds were removed. So let's stick with him. He's going to say a lot of stuff here. So God's cloud of glory was with the people when they came out to protect them. Vilna Gaon claims, somewhat controversially, that when they built the golden calf, they lost that protection. We do hear God saying, like, I'm out. And then Moshe kind of coaxing God not to destroy the people. And God said, okay, I'll send an angel forward. I'm done. And then Moshe kind of like coaxing God to be back in relationship. So the Vilna Gaon kind of translates that into saying God's divine protection was withdrawn after the golden calf. There is some contradictory evidence elsewhere in the Tanakh for that, but that a lot of other sages have attacked the Vilna Gaon for this. But I think what he's hitting at is this sense that God, in Parshat Ki Tisa in Exodus, God does withdraw and only reluctantly comes back. So when they made the golden calf, the clouds of protection were removed. And then they didn't return until they began to make the Mishkan. So that's his supposition, that the Mishkan, that he reads apropos Ein Mukdam U'Me'ochar B'Torah, that the Torah isn't necessarily narrated chronologically, and that the dominant view is that, though not universal, but the dominant view is Rashi's opinion that the commandment to build the Mishkan actually happened after the sin of the golden calf. And so it establishes, when God says, V'shachanti b'tocham, so that I could dwell among them, it's actually significant because God had stopped dwelling among them. God used to dwell among them a little more literally, and then they built a golden calf, and God was like, I'm out. And Moshe coaxes God back, and so God's like, okay, so they should build Vasuli Mikdash, V'shachanti b'tocham. Here's a structure for how it'll happen. So what happens in that in-between period? There's no divine presence. When did they begin to make the Mishkan? The Vilna Gaon does some calculating. Moshe descended from the mountain on Yom Kippur. So that is already in the Mishnah, that the day that Yom Kippur is the day that the second set of the tablets of the Ten Commandments were given. In other words, Moshe shattered the tablets on the 17th of Tammuz, and then there were 40 days waiting, and then another 40 days, Moshe's up in the mountain. 80 days from the 17th of Tammuz gets you to Yom Kippur. So Moshe came down with the second set of tablets, their second chance, on Yom Kippur. And then the day after Yom Kippur, quote, Moshe assembled, Shemot chapter 35, assembled the artisans to start the construction of the Mishkan. That's the 11th of Tishrei. So, and also commanded them about the labor of the Mishkan. So he assembled the crew, the people, and gave them the instruction for how the Mishkan is supposed to be. That's the day after Yom Kippur, the 11th. You have echoes of that when the Ramah says, we start building our Sukkah. Those of you who wanted the Sukkah to replicate the Mishkan, here's where you're getting some echoes of it. The Ramah saying, the 11th of Tishrei, right after Yom Kippur, do something to start building the Mishkan. Anyway, so this was the 11th of Tishrei. And it is written that the people brought him another donation, baboker, baboker. by morning by morning. The simplest reading of that is just it's a repetitive, it's a repetition to indicate that something happened consecutively over time. The Vilna Gaon takes it literally, 2 mornings. So that's the 12th of Tishrei and the 13th of Tishrei were the 2 days in which people brought lots of fabrics, gold, silver, mirrors, like all the stuff that they brought for the construction of the Mishkan. That's the 12th and 13th of Tishrei. On the 14th of Tishrei, all the artisans took the gold and other things from Moshe according to count and weight. So 14th was the day of the art. Today was the day of the artists, the artisans taking inventory of what they have and like putting it in the right place. And on the 15th, they started to make the Mishkan. And that's when the clouds of glory returned. Therefore, we do Sukkot on the 15th of Tishrei. In other words, yes, the Sukkot that we live in commemorate the clouds of glory that God had set up for protection for the Jewish people in their exodus from Egypt. That happened from Pesach. The reason we do them now, though, is to commemorate the restoration of God's divine protection after we had lost it. Going through the experience of regret, of sin, of our own criminality, and the miracle of divine grace that God wombs us. God shows us rachamim, from the word rechem, compassion, which is the sense of allowing us more time to gestate, looking at our sins and saying, they're not ready yet. They need more compassion, more gestational time, more wombing compassion. That's the miracle that we go through on Yom Kippur of forgiveness and a second chance. And the operationalization of that second chance is building a sukkah to show that God's protection for us was re-operationalized after we lost it. The Talmud Bavli, famously, Rabbi Gamliel said there were no days as happy for the Jewish people as the 15th of Av and as Yom Kippur, Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur. A lot of people find the first part of that surprising today. People experience Yom Kippur as a day of solemnity, as a fast day. It must be grief in some day. Judaism doesn't look at Yom Kippur that way. I shouldn't say Judaism. People's experience is part of Judaism. The texts of Rabbinic Judaism do not look at Yom Kippur that day. The texts of Judaism, of Rabbinic Judaism, look at Yom Kippur as the most joyous day, like the pinnacle of joy, the greatest day of the year. And that's obvious. It has to ask why, what's the big deal about Tu B'Av? But for Yom Kippur, granted, Yom Kippur, that's obvious. Bishlama, Yom Kippur, since it has pardon and forgiveness, the day on which the latter pair of tablets were given. Yeah, I mean, a day of being able to start fresh, a day of not being burdened down by our mistakes, that's amazing. And on Sukkot, according to the Vilna Gaon, the Torah has us run from Yom Kippur to Sukkot to translate that experience of grace, of having a second chance, into living in a way that demonstrates our acceptance of that divine protection. I'll pause here and we can spend the last few minutes with questions, comments, reactions. So feel free to raise your hand. I'll look at the chat a little bit. So Lynn Ann writes, so is there greater joy in regaining something lost than in getting it the first time? It seems that way in the Vilna Gaon structuring of this. I think that's the upshot. Like, and think of in your own experience the difference, between getting something that you might have reason to take for granted. But what's the experience of love? Like, if you think that somebody you love was hurt or, God forbid, was killed, and it turns out they're not, they're okay. What's that experience of gratitude, of holding close, that we might have neglected to perform in other times? Marguerite asks, what are some of the critiques of the Vilna Gaon's interpretation here? The main critique of the Vilna Gaon's interpretation is that elsewhere in the Tanakh, if I remember correctly, in a passage in Divrei Hayamim, in the book of Chronicles, it says, if I remember correctly, it says explicitly that the clouds of glory never departed. So the basic, the kind of concept that like God withdrew in some way, that's narrated in great detail in Shemot, but that isn't necessarily linked to the clouds of glory according to another source. And so a lot of other Achronim are like, what do you mean? You're like basing this all, you've got all these sources to like for your chronology, but you just made one big assumption that is contradicted elsewhere in the Tanakh. So, and also there are a lot of other Achronim who disregard that and quote this Vilna Gaon. I found it in an essay of Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner and the Pachad Yitzchak, and many others cited too. Yeah, Laura, go ahead.
So I'm thinking about what you said and wondering if we in our prayers was Ufros Aleinu, Sukkot, and is those Sukkot, is that referring back to the clouds of glory?
That's a great.
Gaon was.
Yeah, it's a great question because we have the word Sukkah used metaphorically in our liturgy all the time. Why is that the metaphor? According to the view, which becomes the by far the dominant view, that the Sukkot that we build commemorate the clouds of glory, then we took the big metaphorical step already just in interpreting physical Sukkot that way. And it's less of a metaphor in the liturgy to say, like, spread over us the Sukkah of your peace to God, because there's a less of a metaphorical leap from, the clouds of glory to whatever other kind of divine protection than there is to like make an immediate leap from a physical structure to divine protection. I will say though, I think it's like a worthwhile exercise that I've taught in other contexts to go through halachot of the Sukkah and think through what those halachot can teach us about the contours of how we're supposed to understand what peace is, divine peace and human peace, based on the availability of a sukkah as a metaphor for peace. Like, for example, what does it mean to think of, so that means that like peace has to be made from organic materials and not kind of like artificial. It has to come from the natural environment, or sukkah can, well, there's a lot of that's a different study. We're at time, so I'm gonna pause here. I know there are lots of other great questions, and I encourage you to discuss them with people you're with over the Chag. Well, I said there was one halachic question. I'll just say briefly: if you live in a place that has a covered balcony or indoors, or you're in an apartment, according to the standard opinions out there, then you don't have the ability to build a sukkah in your place. I personally, we have all trees overhanging our 6 flats yard. Luckily, our next door neighbors have a very open yard and build a sukkah, and we join them in their sukkah. And that's what people do. They find a shul that has a sukkah, they find other people. Not everybody can necessarily, especially in cities, live in a place where they can build a sukkah. Shabbat shalom and Chag Sameach, everybody. I'll kick it back to Mara.